The morning mist hung heavy over Heathrow Airport as Camilla Parker Bowles stepped out of the royal limousine, her designer heels clicking against the wet pavement. She moved with practiced grace, her cream-colored coat billowing slightly in the autumn breeze. Behind her, two palace staff members carefully lifted several ornate cases from the vehicle's trunk, their faces tense with concentration. Detective Inspector Sarah Mitchell watched from her position near the VIP terminal entrance. Something felt off about this departure. The Queen Consort's travel plans had been scheduled weeks in advance, but the sudden addition of multiple secured cases to her luggage manifest had raised red flags within palace security circles. Sarah had been quietly monitoring the situation for the past 3 days, ever since a concerned palace insider had reached out through unofficial channels. The late Queen Elizabeth II had passed away just 6 months prior, and the distribution of her personal effects was still being carefully managed by the Royal Collection Trust. Every piece of jewelry, every artifact, every family heirloom was meticulously catalogued and accounted for. The idea that items might be leaving the country without proper documentation was deeply troubling to those charged with preserving the monarchy's heritage. Camilla approached the security checkpoint with her usual confidence, flanked by her personal protection officer, Detective Sergeant James Crawford. Crawford was a 20-year veteran of royal protection duties, known for his unwavering loyalty and discretion. However, even he seemed unusually alert this morning, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. As they reached the VIP security area, Sarah noticed a third figure emerging from the shadows of the terminal building. Commander Michael Hartwell of the Royal Protection Unit stepped forward, his military bearing unmistakable even in civilian clothes. His presence here was highly unusual. Hartwell typically only involved himself in matters of the highest sensitivity. The security screening process began routinely enough. Camilla's personal items passed through the scanner without incident, and she herself walked through the metal detector with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to such procedures. It was when the larger cases were brought forward that the atmosphere began to shift. The first case, a mahogany box with brass fittings, seemed innocuous enough. The security officer glanced at the documentation provided by the palace staff and nodded approvingly. But as the second case was placed on the conveyor belt, the X-ray operator's expression changed dramatically. She leaned closer to her screen, her finger tracing the outline of what appeared to be several large, ornate objects. Sarah watched as the operator called her supervisor over, their hushed conversation growing increasingly animated. The supervisor, a woman named Helen Torres with 15 years of aviation security experience, studied the screen intently before looking up at Camilla with barely concealed concern. Meanwhile, Camilla maintained her composure, chatting casually with her aide about their destination, a private estate in Switzerland, where she planned to spend a quiet weekend away from the intense scrutiny of the British press. The conversation seemed natural enough, but Sarah noticed the slight tension in Camilla's shoulders, the way her fingers drummed silently against her handbag. Torres approached Detective Sergeant Crawford and requested additional documentation for the cases. Crawford produced a folder of papers, but Torres's frown deepened as she reviewed them. The documents bore all the appropriate royal seals and signatures, yet something about their timing troubled her. They had been issued just 24 hours earlier, rushing through a process that typically took weeks to complete. It was then that Commander Hartwell made his move. He approached the security station with measured steps, his identification already in hand. The sight of his credentials sent a visible wave of tension through the assembled group. Hartwell was not just any royal protection officer. He was the man responsible for safeguarding the crown's most precious assets. Camilla's eyes met Hartwell's, and for a moment, the carefully maintained facade of casual travel seemed to crack slightly. She straightened her shoulders and offered him a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The security team, now fully alert to the gravity of the situation, began a more thorough examination of the cases. As the first ornate box was opened, gasps echoed through the VIP area. Inside, nestled in custom-fitted velvet, lay a stunning diamond necklace that Torres immediately recognized from photographs she had seen in royal exhibitions. The piece was unmistakably part of the late Queen's personal collection. The second case revealed even more concerning contents. A pair of emerald earrings that had been photographed on Queen Elizabeth II during her final public appearance, along with several brooches that bore the distinctive marks of the crown jewelers, were carefully arranged within. Each piece represented not just monetary value, but centuries of royal history and tradition. Camilla's aide stepped forward, attempting to explain that these were personal gifts from Her late Majesty to the Queen Consort, items that had been bequeathed privately and were therefore not subject to the usual restrictions governing royal collection pieces. However, Hartwell's expression remained stern as he examined the documentation more closely. The problem, Hartwell explained quietly to Torres, was not necessarily the legitimacy of the ownership transfer, but rather the timing and manner of the item's departure from the country. Protocol dictated that any significant pieces from the royal collection, regardless of their new ownership status, should undergo a proper evaluation period before leaving British soil. This was particularly important given the ongoing process of cataloging and distributing the late Queen's extensive personal effects. As the tension in the VIP area continued to mount, other travelers began to take notice of the unusual activity. Airport staff moved discreetly to redirect foot traffic away from the security checkpoint, while additional personnel were called in to assist with what was rapidly becoming a delicate diplomatic situation. Detective Inspector Mitchell stepped closer to observe the proceedings, her trained eye noting every detail of the unfolding drama. The cases contained pieces that would be virtually impossible to replace if lost or stolen, artifacts that represented irreplaceable links to British royal history. The question now was whether their removal from the country, even by someone with apparent legal claim to them, was appropriate under current circumstances. The atmosphere grew increasingly tense as Hartwell made a series of quiet phone calls, presumably to senior officials at Buckingham Palace, and possibly even to members of the government. The fate of Camilla's travel plans now hung in the balance, dependent on decisions being made at the highest levels of the British establishment. Camilla herself remained outwardly calm, though those observing closely could see the subtle signs of growing frustration. Her fingers tapped more insistently against her handbag, and she exchanged increasingly serious whispered conversations with her protection officer and aide. The morning that had begun as a routine departure was rapidly transforming into something far more significant. A test of the delicate balance between royal privilege, legal authority, and the preservation of national heritage. As the minutes ticked by, it became clear that this situation would not be resolved quickly or quietly, and that the decisions made in the next few hours could have far-reaching implications for the royal family and the British monarchy as a whole. Commander Hartwell's phone conversations had yielded results that nobody at Heathrow Airport had expected. Within 30 minutes of his first call, a convoy of black vehicles had arrived at the terminal, carrying representatives from the Royal Collection Trust, the Lord Chamberlain's office, and most surprisingly, 2 senior members of Parliament's Culture, Media and Sport Committee. The VIP lounge had been quietly evacuated and converted into an impromptu meeting space where the various parties could discuss the situation away from public view. Camilla found herself seated at a polished conference table, facing a panel of officials whose expressions ranged from diplomatic concern to barely concealed suspicion. Dr. Jonathan Pemberton, director of the Royal Collection Trust, spread several thick folders across the table. His usually composed demeanor showed signs of strain as he began to explain the complexity of the situation to those assembled. The late Queen's personal effects, he revealed, had been divided into several categories during the probate process. Some items were clearly designated for the royal collection and would remain in trust for the nation. Others were personal bequests to family members, but a significant number of pieces existed in a gray area where the Queen's personal ownership intersected with items of national significance. The pieces in Camilla's cases fell squarely into this problematic category. While there was documentation suggesting that Queen Elizabeth had indeed intended for Camilla to inherit them, the timing of their removal from royal custody had bypassed several important steps in the verification process. More troubling still, some of the pieces had been photographed and catalogued as part of the royal collection just weeks before the Queen's death, creating a paper trail that contradicted their classification as personal gifts. Margaret Thornfield, representing the Lord Chamberlain's office, added another layer of complexity to the discussion. The Queen's will, she explained, was an extraordinarily detailed document that had been crafted over many years, with input from legal experts, royal historians, and government officials. Every significant bequest had been carefully considered not just for its personal meaning, but for its potential impact on the monarchy's public image and financial standing. The problem, Thornfield continued, was that some of the items now in question appeared to have been added to Camilla's inheritance through a codicil to the will that had been executed in the final weeks of the Queen's life. This timing, while not necessarily improper, had raised concerns among the Queen's advisors about the possibility of undue influence or confusion during a period when Her Majesty's health was clearly declining. Detective Sergeant Crawford shifted uncomfortably in his chair as these revelations unfolded. As Camilla's protection officer, he had been aware of several private meetings between the Queen Consort and the late Queen in those final weeks, but the nature of their discussions had been kept strictly confidential. Now he found himself wondering whether those meetings had involved more than the personal conversations he had assumed them to be. Sarah Mitchell, who had been granted permission to observe the proceedings, noticed the subtle changes in body language around the table as each new piece of information was revealed. Camilla's initial confidence had given way to a more guarded posture, while her aide seemed increasingly nervous, frequently checking her phone and whispering urgent updates to someone on the other end of hushed calls. The situation took an even more dramatic turn when Dr. Pemberton produced a series of photographs from his briefcase. The images, taken during a routine cataloging session just 3 weeks before the Queen's death, clearly showed the contested pieces displayed in the Queen's private apartments at Windsor Castle. Each item was photographed with a small placard indicating its status as part of the royal collection, documenting that had been completed as part of a comprehensive inventory ordered by the Queen herself. This photographic evidence created a significant problem for Camilla's legal position. If the items had been officially catalogued as part of the royal collection so close to the Queen's death, their subsequent transfer to personal ownership would require much more substantial documentation than what had been provided. The codicil to the will, while potentially valid, would need to be examined more closely to determine whether it had been executed with full understanding of these cataloging decisions. Commander Hartwell received another call, this one lasting nearly 15 minutes. When he finished, his expression was grim. The call had come from the private secretary to the king, and the message was clear. Until the provenance and ownership status of the contested items could be definitively established, they would need to remain within the United Kingdom under secure custody. The implications of this decision hit Camilla immediately. Not only would her travel plans need to be cancelled, but the items she had believed to be rightfully hers would be removed from her possession, pending a full investigation. The embarrassment of such a public reversal would be significant, potentially calling into question her judgment and raising uncomfortable questions about her relationship with the late Queen during those crucial final weeks. Airport security had been quietly implementing additional measures throughout the morning. The VIP area had been cordoned off, and additional personnel had been stationed at various checkpoints to ensure that news of the situation didn't leak to the press. However, the presence of so many official vehicles and the extended closure of the VIP facility was beginning to attract attention from other travelers and airport staff. Helen Torres, the security supervisor, found herself in an unprecedented situation. In her 15 years of aviation security experience, she had dealt with various diplomatic incidents and security concerns, but never anything involving the direct seizure of royal assets. The legal protocols for such a situation were murky at best, requiring coordination between multiple government departments and law enforcement agencies. Detective Inspector Mitchell had been making careful notes throughout the proceedings, documenting every aspect of the unfolding situation for her superiors at Scotland Yard. The case had already evolved far beyond a simple customs matter, potentially involving issues of inheritance fraud, royal protocol violations, and even questions of national security, given the historical significance of the items involved. As the morning stretched into afternoon, additional experts arrived to examine the contested pieces. A representative from Sotheby's auction house, Dr. Elizabeth Harrington, was brought in to provide independent valuations and historical context for each item. Her preliminary assessment sent another shockwave through the assembled group. The collective value of the pieces exceeded £12 million, making this one of the largest single transfers of royal assets in modern history. Dr. Harrington's expertise revealed additional troubling details about the item's provenance. Several of the pieces bore jewelers' marks, indicating they had been reset or modified within the past 2 years, suggesting that someone had been making significant alterations to historically significant pieces without proper oversight from the Royal Collection Trust. Such modifications, while not necessarily illegal, represented a serious breach of protocol regarding the preservation of royal heritage items. The psychological pressure on Camilla was becoming increasingly evident. What had begun as a confident departure for a weekend getaway had transformed into a public examination of her conduct during some of the most sensitive moments in recent royal history. The presence of parliamentary representatives added a political dimension that threatened to escalate the situation beyond mere family disagreement into a matter of constitutional significance. Commander Hartwell made another series of calls, each more urgent than the last. The decisions being made were now involving the highest levels of government, with potential implications for the monarchy's relationship with Parliament and the public's perception of royal accountability. The items in question represented more than their monetary value. They were symbols of continuity and tradition that the nation expected to be carefully preserved and protected. As the afternoon wore on, it became clear that this situation would not be resolved quickly or quietly. The contested heirlooms would need to be secured, extensive legal reviews would be required, and potentially embarrassing questions about the late Queen's final decisions would need to be answered. What had begun as a routine travel day had evolved into a constitutional crisis that would test the very foundations of royal protocol and public trust. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Heathrow Airport had implemented what officials euphemistically called enhanced security protocols, but what amounted to a partial lockdown of Terminal 5's VIP section. News crews had begun gathering outside the airport perimeter, drawn by reports of unusual activity and the visible presence of government vehicles that had been streaming in and out throughout the day. Inside the converted conference room, the situation had reached a critical juncture. King Charles III's private secretary, Sir Edmund Rothschild, had arrived from Buckingham Palace carrying sealed documents that would prove to be the key to resolving the crisis. His presence immediately elevated the proceedings to the highest level of royal protocol, signaling that the monarchy itself was taking direct control of the situation. Sir Edmund's revelations were both shocking and illuminating. The sealed documents he carried included correspondence between Queen Elizabeth II and her legal advisors from her final months, expressing concerns about the distribution of certain personal items. The Queen, it appeared, had been aware that some pieces in her private collection had significant historical value that extended beyond their personal meaning to her family. The most damning document was a handwritten note from the Queen, dated just 2 weeks before her death, expressing specific reservations about a codicil that had been prepared for her signature. In her own words, she worried that the transfer of certain high-value pieces to family members might create unfortunate precedents and potentially expose the monarchy to criticism about the management of national treasures. Dr. Pemberton, from the Royal Collection Trust, examined these documents with growing amazement. They revealed that the Queen had actually requested additional time to consider the implications of the proposed transfers, time that had apparently not been provided before her death. The codicil had been signed, but under circumstances that now appeared to have been rushed and potentially contrary to the Queen's expressed wishes for careful consideration. Camilla's legal position, which had seemed questionable but potentially defensible earlier in the day, was now looking increasingly untenable. The documentation she had relied upon to justify taking possession of the items was technically valid, but it contradicted the clear intent expressed in the Queen's final correspondence. More troubling still, some of the pieces had been transferred to her personal custody before the codicil had even been executed, suggesting a premature assumption of ownership. Commander Hartwell had been in communication with officials from the Crown Prosecution Service throughout the afternoon, discussing the potential legal implications of the situation. While criminal charges seemed unlikely given the family relationships involved, the possibility of civil action to recover the items was very real. The government's position was becoming clear. Items of such historical and monetary significance could not be allowed to leave the country under disputed ownership. Detective Inspector Sarah Mitchell had been observing the psychological dynamics of the situation with professional interest. Camilla's demeanor had evolved throughout the day, from confidence to defensive concern to what now appeared to be resignation. Her aide had become increasingly agitated, making frequent calls that seemed to be damage control communications with media representatives and royal household staff. The arrival of Queen Consort's personal lawyer, Sir Marcus Pemberley, added another layer of complexity to the proceedings. Pemberley was known for his expertise in royal inheritance law and had represented various members of the royal family in sensitive legal matters for over 2 decades. His immediate assessment of the situation was sobering. While Camilla might have legal standing to claim the items, the public relations implications of pursuing that claim would be devastating. Sir Edmund presented what he described as the king's preferred resolution to the situation. Camilla would voluntarily surrender the contested items to the Royal Collection Trust pending a comprehensive review of their proper ownership status. In return, the matter would be handled discreetly, without public disclosure of the specific items involved, or the circumstances that had led to their contested status. This solution would preserve both the monarchy's dignity and the integrity of the national collection. However, this resolution came with significant personal cost for Camilla. Beyond the loss of items she had believed to be rightfully hers, there would be questions about her judgment and potentially her understanding of royal protocol during one of the most sensitive periods in recent history. The incident would likely be documented in official royal records, creating a permanent reminder of this embarrassing episode. The negotiation over the specific terms of the resolution took several more hours. Dr. Harrington from Sotheby's was asked to prepare detailed documentation of each item's condition and historical significance, creating a record that would be essential for any future ownership determinations. This process revealed additional concerning details about modifications that had been made to some pieces, alterations that appeared to have been done without proper consultation with royal historians or conservation experts. As evening approached, the assembled officials reached a final agreement. Camilla would surrender all contested items immediately, with the understanding that a formal review process would be conducted over the coming months to determine their proper disposal. Some items might ultimately be returned to her if their status as personal gifts could be definitively established, but others would likely remain permanently with the royal collection. The logistics of securing and transporting the items required careful coordination between airport security, royal protection officers, and representatives from the Royal Collection Trust. Each piece was photographed, catalogued, and secured in specialized transport cases designed to protect artifacts during movement. The process took nearly 2 hours, during which Camilla sat quietly in the conference room, occasionally speaking in hushed tones with her lawyer. Commander Hartwell supervised the final security arrangements personally, ensuring that the items would be transported directly to secure storage facilities at the Tower of London pending their ultimate disposition. The symbolic significance of this destination was not lost on anyone present. The Tower had served as the repository for royal treasures for centuries, and its selection as temporary storage sent a clear message about the seriousness with which the situation was being treated. The question of public disclosure remained delicate. While the incident could not be entirely suppressed given the number of officials involved and the disruption it had caused at Heathrow, there was agreement to limit initial statements to vague references to routine security protocols and administrative matters involving royal collection items. The full details would be kept confidential pending completion of the ownership review. As the sun set over London, Camilla finally emerged from the airport terminal, her planned Swiss weekend having been cancelled, and her reputation within royal circles significantly damaged. The images of her departure, captured by photographers who had been waiting for hours, showed a woman who appeared far different from the confident traveler who had arrived that morning. Her security detail was notably increased, and her usual interaction with media was replaced by a hurried transfer to a waiting vehicle. Detective Inspector Mitchell compiled her final report on the incident as airport operations gradually returned to normal. The case would remain officially open pending the results of the Royal Collection Trust's investigation, but her role in the immediate crisis had concluded. She had witnessed something unprecedented in modern royal history. A direct confrontation between personal privilege and institutional responsibility that had ultimately been resolved in favor of preserving national heritage. The broader implications of the day's events would continue to resonate for months to come. Questions about the management of royal assets, the protocols governing inheritance of historically significant items, and the proper balance between family privacy and public accountability would all require careful consideration by constitutional experts and government officials. The contested heirlooms, now safely secured in the Tower of London, represented more than their considerable monetary value. They had become symbols of the ongoing evolution of the British monarchy. Reminders that even the most privileged members of society remained accountable to the institutions and traditions that defined the nation's heritage. The Royal Guard had indeed stopped Camilla from leaving with the late Queen's treasures, but more importantly, they had preserved something far more valuable: the principle that no individual, regardless of their position, stood above the responsibility to protect the cultural legacy of the British people.